We are going to end this unit focused on Haiti and the Haitian Revolution. This is a very interesting case study when we examine independence movements in the late 18th or early 19th century in the Western Hemisphere, because it was and still remains one of the first and only successful slave revolutions. So, first of all, know where Haiti is. Haiti is actually the island of Hispaniola, one of the first islands to be discovered by Columbus, and it was an interesting island. If you notice, it's right up here where it's yellow and blue, and it's yellow and blue because it was divided between the French in blue and the yellow by the Spanish. And so this was an island that was actually owned or colonized by two separate countries. And if you remember some of the things maybe from your sophomore year in history about how Spanish and the French really kind of were never in conflict in the Americas as far as North America, because they were on separate sides of the North American colonies, there was definitely some kind of separate ways between them, and some connections in Europe as far as the monarchy and the family. And so they managed to run what would become eventually the Dominican Republic, which was the Spanish side, and the French side, which would eventually become Haiti. Well, initially in the 18th century, it was referred to as Saint-Domingue. And I don't really know the French way to say this, but essentially it was considered one of the richest colonies in the world in the 1700s. And it was the crown jewel of the French colonies, particularly because it was a completely slave-based economic labor system in production of sugarcane. So the first thing that we need to understand looking at this revolution, and in all the revolutions that we've looked at, we've always paid attention to kind of the social breakdown of how these things happen. And we talked about the United States, how they had this, obvious white male-dominated society with the founding fathers leading the revolution, and then we went down to women, and then we went down to people who were not landowning white men, and then we went into the slave system and then the native population. Well, Haiti is unique in the sense that there's absolutely no native population at this point in the 1700s. It was completely decimated, or almost completely decimated by the European influence of disease and basically pushing them off of the island more or less. And their society is based on these three castes. The first caste were all the white people. And these were basically the ground affluent Spanish American Creoles. They were the French planters, landowners, maritime agents, basically the business owners. And then they were coincided by the Petit Blanc, who were kind of the managers. So were the ones who ran the plantations, they ran the groceries, they ran the stores, they were the shipping agents, the captains, the ships. And this is a completely commodity-based system. So they are not producing anything in Haiti except goods that they are selling, exporting for sugar production or import for sale on the island. So that is your ruling class. And they were then coincided with a second and third caste that were all based on color. And typically the second class were what they refer to as the mulatto class. And they essentially were a combination of people who had been freed by slavery or were family members of the Petit Blanc. And so in kind of understanding this, they typically had full French citizenship, but they did not have any of the equality that granted. And so France has very interesting race relations. And so it's kind of an interesting situation, very different from the other colonies. And while they didn't have necessarily political equality, many of the people of the second caste had pretty good economic equality, and they in times were very wealthy and powerful through their ownership. And this is going to create kind of a very interesting group that is going to be kind of used by the slave caste, the third caste, and then also the Petit Blanc. And essentially, the revolution kind of is fought between the third caste, which there were over 500,000 slaves by 1791, and one of the most brutal slave systems that the world has ever seen. And then they actually were divided into a group of Maroons, which were basically runaway slaves that created their own colonies in the mountain regions and typically plotted and acted against the slave system, either by poisoning slaves, acting against freed slaves, and some of the mulatto groups, and then also very blatantly attacking the Petit Blanc who owned or ran the plantation system. And typically, many of these former slaves were the ones that became the leaders of the Haitian Revolution. So kind of an interesting situation is happening here where you have the Grand Blanc who are kind of in charge, but on the ground, you're having basically a fight between the slaves rebelling and then the Petit Blanc who ran the slave system. And in the middle are the group of free slaves who have basically a lot to gain with the slave revolution, but also a lot to lose because they're going to be kind of caught in the middle, and typically were ones that were viewed as kind of the by the slave class or the runaway class as being, kind of the evil traitors, to their own people. And then on the other side, they don't necessarily love being part of the system, but what are their other options at this point on Haiti? So the leader of this revolution is Toussaint Louverture. He was an escaped slave living among the Maroon groups in the mountain regions in central part of Haiti, and basically led a group of former slaves in the Haitian Revolution, of which he became leader of Haiti in 1800. And unfortunately, because of the act of Napoleon, who basically looks at this revolution as a major mark against his world domination. Like I said, he was a big money maker for them, and he at this time is trying to take over the entire world and is going as far east as Russia, as well as taking over Spain. So in 1804, he decides to go back and take Louverture's government back from him, looking at this insurrection as kind of a mark against his quality as a leader. And unfortunately, it was very difficult, or fortunately, it's very difficult to attack Haiti. I mean, it's always difficult to attack an island. The French military wasn't really prepared for this type of fighting. And in fact, one of the interesting notes of this, in trying to pay for this, Napoleon is said to have basically made a decision to sell the Louisiana Purchase to the Americans in order to finance the takeover of Haiti, which eventually is defeated. However, he was able, in the act of doing this, to capture Louverture. He's brought back to France and eventually dies. The thing about this independence is that it created a very bloody situation. Like I said, there was a lot of connections socially between the Petit Blanc and the mulatto or freed slaves group. And typically, that's because the Petit Blanc essentially were usually maybe the parents or the relationships that happened between the Petit Blanc and the Maroon or freed slaves created this kind of an over closer relationship that was economically divisive, and then also became kind of real as far as ethnic connections and nasty. And really, there are countless stories of basically, the captured slave rebels responding to the whites' actions with complete massacres of families, and then the Petit Blanc or the slave holders essentially turning and massacring their own slaves as a way to kind of show the rebels, hey, look at this power. And despite the French power in the region, Haiti managed to become an independent state by 1804, making itself the only successful slave revolt in history. So we're going to spend a couple days doing some significant things at looking at the individuals involved in this in kind of a mock simulation, because it brings about a lot of questions that will lead us in the second try looking at the institution of slavery and what made that institution unique in areas of the Americas, because it becomes a very defining piece of a lot of the history of the Americas and how it was different. And Haiti gives a kind of a very, very clear look to see and examine and analyze what it actually was about slavery. So the next assignment is a little reading assignment that is connected to the Choices program, and that PDF is in Schoology. You need to do that reading and then take a reading quiz, and then along the lines we're going to do a little more creative work in looking at the ideas of what do you do when the institution of slavery has permeated politics, the economy, and society to create an entirely unique and different life. And when that independence comes, how will you deal with that society that runs off the system? So we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next few days.